Yeah, you're still muted. Hold on a second. All right, everyone's joining up here. Hi, Mark. Welcome. Do you see on your page, Mary, where it's got the icon to unmute? Let me see if I can do it on my end. No, I don't have the ability to unmute you, Mary. There we go. I heard somebody chiming in there. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Mary, we'll just kind of work through here, and I'll see if I can get you on your end. It looks like you're muted. I've got it set on here as everyone can turn on their microphone. So you should be able to access your microphone so you can actually talk. I know Jason was talking earlier. Jonathan was able to chime in at a time by turning his microphone on. But we'll go through the presentation first, Mary, and then while this video is playing, I'm just going to get a little sidebar going with you to see about getting you unmuted. But just to give you a brief introduction, my name's Sam Canders, and I am one of the FAA safety team members here in the state of Maine. And we have a mission we aren't part of the FAA, but we have a mission to work with the general aviation public as representatives of the FAA to help promote the FAA safety message. So therefore, every month they have a topic of the month. And there are topics in the general aviation community that are been determined to be high risk or just high occurrence events, and they're just doing an outreach program to try to get people to learn more about certain topics that the FAA has determined to be of significance to the general aviation public. So the topic for this month is avoiding controlled flight into terrain accidents, and there's also a piece on here about continuation bias. So we'll go ahead and unfortunately for this one, I actually have a video. This one has been filmed, so I'm going to hit play on this. And then Mary, I'm probably going to send you a message, and I'll try to have a sidebar conversation with you about trying to figure out your muting problem.
Joint Steering Committee, a work group that studies general aviation. The topic of the month for November 2018 is controlled flight into terrain. In this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about controlled flight into terrain, CFIT accidents, and recommendations termed safety enhancements from the General Aviation Joint Steering Committee, a work group that studies general aviation accidents. We'll discuss some safety risk management and technological solutions to CFIT challenges, and finally, we'll give you some tips and tricks that will help you to avoid CFIT accidents. CFIT is defined as an unintentional collision with terrain while an aircraft is under positive control. For this presentation, we looked at a typical year in which we see about 40 CFIT accidents, at least half of which are fatal. It's logical to think that CFIT accidents usually involve inexperienced pilots in dark night and/or instrument meteorological conditions. In fact, in a typical year, more than 75% of CFIT accidents occur in daylight, and more than half of those are in visual conditions. As we might expect, the majority of CFIT pilots hold private certificates, but commercial and ATP pilots, as well as flight instructors, are also well represented. You might think that most CFIT pilots are not instrument rated, and that's correct. But in a typical year, more than a third of CFIT pilots hold instrument ratings. Continued VFR into IMC is the deadliest accident precursor. We don't know how often pilots are successful in pursuing the impossible dream. Undoubtedly, some get away safely, but continued VFR into IMC accidents are usually fatal. Of the 41 accidents in our study group, 11, or 25% of the total, were preceded by continued VFR into IMC, and they were all fatal. You'd think that VFR pilots would more often be involved in continued VFR accidents, but they were evenly split in this study group. IFR procedural mistakes account for a significant portion of CFIT accidents each year. Instrument pilots must be sure they're complying with all aspects of the clearances they accept and the procedures they fly. Wire strikes are often cited in CFIT accident reports, and they are common in agricultural operations, but more than half of them are not associated with ag flying. It's true that there are some very high towers around, and their support wires can extend well beyond the tower itself, but there are relatively few collisions with tall towers or their support structures. In fact, most wire strikes occur below 200 feet AGL. You've got to wonder, what required the pilots to be that low, especially in the vicinity of wires? And be aware that many wires are unmarked. Give yourself some room. A little extra altitude, even 500 feet, will keep you above 90% of the wires. Some CFIT accidents are caused by unrealistic expectations for aircraft performance. High-density altitude combined with a shorter and/or obstructed runway and aircraft at near gross weight have resulted in collisions with obstacles on takeoff. Carburetor or induction system ice can reduce climb performance with the same result. And tailwinds on approach or takeoff can precede CFIT. Finally, we had one pilot incapacitation accident, 2 intentional collisions with terrain, only one of which was fatal, and 2 accidents involving U.S. registered aircraft operating abroad. Safety risk management is all about knowing what you're getting into and understanding what capabilities and resources you have that will ensure that each flight is completed safely. SRM begins with a solid pre-flight risk assessment. The assessment considers the pilot, the aircraft, the environment within which the flight will take place, and external pressures that may affect pilot judgment and performance. There are various flight risk assessment tools, or FRATs, available to assist pilots in building their risk assessments. Good pre-flight risk assessments mean you'll have excellent situational awareness when you take off. The trick is to maintain that awareness until you're tied down or in the hangar at your destination. Maintaining situational awareness means you're constantly adjusting your assessments by answering questions such as, is the weather what I expected? Is my ground speed as predicted? How long will it be till I get to the next checkpoint or to my destination? What will be my fuel status when I get there? Harder to answer are questions such as, am I becoming fatigued? Can I continue with my flight as planned, or is it time to adjust my expectations? Am I making my decisions solely on the safety of flight, or am I feeling pressure to complete the flight as planned? That brings us to planned continuation bias. You may know it as get-there-itis. Whatever you call it, it's real, and every pilot must learn how to rationally deal with it. This deadly bias will tempt you to delay resorting to Plan B until you've already entered instrument meteorological conditions while trying to maintain VFR. It's also contributed to pilots overflying en route fueling opportunities and running short of fuel at the destination. We'll discuss this in depth in an upcoming topic of the month, but for now, deal with get-there-itis by having a Plan B and maybe even C, and make the decision to go to it before an emergency is in progress. On 29 December 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401, Lockheed L-1011, was scheduled to fly from JFK in New York to Miami International Airport in Florida. 3 flight crew and 1 non-revenue company employee were in the cockpit as the flight began the approach to Miami. After extending the landing gear on final approach, the first officer noticed the nose wheel down and locked light was not illuminated. The approach was aborted and the aircraft entered a 2,000-foot holding pattern west of the airport. The crew engaged the autopilot while all 4 cockpit occupants engaged in troubleshooting the problem. When the autopilot was engaged, It was inadvertently placed in control wheel steering CWS mode. In this mode, the airplane would maintain the altitude last commanded by the pilot. One of the pilots, most likely the captain, bumped the control column as he turned to speak with the flight engineer. The airplane was placed in a shallow descent that was maintained all the way to the ground. 4 professional aviators, any one of whom could have detected the descent, were so focused on a non-critical task that they failed to detect and arrest the descent. Autopilots are great at reducing pilot workload, and let's face it, they fly more precisely than we do. But autopilots must be monitored because they will maintain heading and altitude right into the ground if that's what you've asked them to do. Distracted pilots have flown aircraft into terrain without autopilot assistance as well. No matter what you're dealing with, you must fly the aircraft first. Make sure you're always under control, properly configured, and in a safe flight environment. There are a host of technological programs, applications, and devices that can aid pilots in situational awareness and risk assessment. Moving maps with terrain overlays are common, so there's no excuse for not knowing how close you are to a collision. Flight planning tools can now integrate with charting programs, cockpit displays, and weather imagery. FRAT applications make it easy to conduct pre- and in-flight risk assessments, and performance monitoring equipment keep pilots apprised of their aircraft's capability. Pilots have access to more information than ever before, and that has already contributed to a 20-year reduction in CFIT accidents. But all that information comes in many different forms, so pilots must be thoroughly familiar with and proficient in device operation and information interpretation. Successful professionals, no matter what their specialty, rely on coaching to keep them on top of their game. Pilots are no exception. Regular proficiency training with a flight instructor is the best investment you can make in safety and peace of mind. There are a wealth of proficiency training programs available. Of course, we recommend FAA Wings Pilot Proficiency Training, but no matter what program or instructor you choose, please participate in scenario-based training. This holistic approach to proficiency looks at all aspects of safe flight, from pre-flight planning to securing the aircraft at the end of the flight. Holistic training reinforces your skill at collectively managing all pilot processes and tasks in realistic scenarios. You can keep your skills sharp between flights by flying simulators or flight training devices. Many feature realistic graphics so you can get a look at unfamiliar destination environments, and you can practice instrument procedures before you have to fly them for real. But one caution here: simulation is not adequate preparation for flights to unfamiliar, challenging, if not hostile environments such as mountains, obstructed short runways, and high-density altitude environments. For those areas, consult a flight instructor who is thoroughly familiar with the environment. Simulation works well as a solo activity, but it's much better if you have a flight instructor managing the simulator and scenario while you do the flying. Moving map, enhanced and synthetic vision technology is now available on installed equipment and handheld devices. Nothing has done more for situational awareness than this technology, but you have to commit to keeping the databases up to date, and you must confirm that you're looking at the latest weather imagery. Also, be aware that even the latest weather pictures are not real time, so give a wide berth to any weather you're trying to avoid. And the availability of this technology has given rise to a paradox. Pilots are more situationally aware than ever before, but CFIT and weather accidents still occur, and pilot deviations continue to rise. Perhaps this is because pilots are more confident in their position, so they fly closer to things they're trying to avoid. Obviously, the solution is to give yourself some breathing room. That means at least a mile from airspace and 2,000 feet vertically from terrain you're trying to avoid. Airspace and terrain don't move much, but weather is very dynamic, so greater clearance distances will be required. Now for a quick review. Wire strikes are almost exclusively confined to agricultural operations. False. Many wire strikes do occur in agricultural operations, but they occur in en route operations as well. CFIT accidents occur primarily during night conditions. False. The majority of CFIT accidents occur during the day. 2/3 of CFIT accidents occur in IMC conditions. False. CFIT accidents are almost evenly split between IMC and VMC conditions. The order of priority in performing pilot tasks is A. Communicate, aviate, navigate. B. Aviate, communicate, navigate. Or C. Aviate, navigate, communicate. The correct answer is C. Aviate, navigate, communicate. It's true that all of these things happen at nearly the same time, but your first priority is to fly the airplane, followed by navigating so as to avoid impacting terrain. Once you've got those under control, it's time to communicate your intentions. Good practices to avoid CFIT are A. Manage distractions. B. Seek proficiency training. C. Give yourself some room. D. Use flight risk assessment tools. E. Fly at least 500 AGL to avoid wires. Or F. All of the above. The correct answer is F. All of the above. Please direct any questions to your local FAST team representative. Narration by Bradford Wood, FAST Team National Outreach Manager.
All right, I've got a little follow-up scenario here to go over, but first there's a short video here that I want to show you that's just more on the continuation bias, and that'll serve as a segue into an accident that probably a lot of you are familiar with here in Maine. That is an example of controlled flight into terrain and also planned continuation bias. And I was going to speak to that a little bit. And then after that, we'll speak with Mary Bild. She's on the line. And we'll talk about her background. And then we'll let her chime in on her own personal experience in aviation and any real world scenarios that maybe she dealt with planned continuation bias or controlled flight into terrain.
We often say there's no place like home, or home is where the heart is, or even home sweet home. Maybe that's why so many pilots risk their lives to get home with a condition we call get-home-itis, or sometimes get-there-itis. Let's talk about planned continuation bias next on 57 Seconds to Safer Flying. As pilots, we tend to be mission-oriented. When we've been given a goal, our egos take a hit if we don't achieve it. A pilot and a passenger were returning IFR to Olive Branch, Mississippi, in a Piper Arrow to ceilings at only 300 feet AGL and low visibility. In 1998, runway 18 only had a non-precision approach. After going missed approach on the second attempt, the pilot neglected to climb and hit trees south of the field, killing both on board. So why didn't this pilot head just 10 miles away to Memphis International for an ILS approach? Well, his car was parked back at Olive Branch. Planned continuation bias is when a person continues with a plan despite poor or worsening circumstances for the plan's success. All of us have dealt with these temptations, sometimes known as get-there-itis. This pilot had let a potential inconvenience sway his decision-making. Don't be suckered by planned continuation bias. Before launching out, do some homework. Talk to a seasoned pilot. Realize your situation and go for the safest option you have. Postpone the trip, change the destination, or stop en route to reassess. Using these tactics will reduce your risk and increase your margin of safety to an acceptable level. Realize that sometimes a mission-oriented attitude is not the best mindset for a pilot. For the FAA safety team, I'm Phil Dixon.
Right. So this video posted recently, and somebody actually shared this. Not this one. Let me pause this real quick.
Pilots are trained to trust their.
I don't know why that one's playing. All right. So up in Presque Isle, United Express had an accident up there, and some of you may have seen that. They actually did a single ILS approach, and then they actually did a missed approach, came back around, and they did a second approach. And without having any visual contact with the ground, they executed what was supposed to be a landing, but they were offset from the landing runway 1. So I just want to talk a little bit about this because there's a lot of continuation bias, and this is obviously a controlled flight into terrain that you all may be well aware of. Interesting thing about this, if you watch this video, I posted it in the notes for the Facebook meeting. You can see the YouTube in there, and you can watch this on your own. But the first officer had actually been up there the day before and had flown the ILS up there, and he had noticed when you're flying in a complex aircraft, that they have a magenta line to give you flight guidance, and then they also have green needles to give you guidance as well. And the difference between the two, the magenta lines would be flight management system derived, which would be a GPS and IRS solution to the aircraft, whereas the green needles would be the actual, say, the localizer or the glide slope, an external navigation device or VOR. So in this case, the co-pilot had been up there in VFR conditions in Presque Isle, and they had done the approach, and when they had vectors in, they were up magenta needles. And he noticed that there was some variation between the magenta needles and what the green needles were doing when they switched over. So they should be right on top of each other. And he noticed it, but they were in VFR conditions, and they ended up landing the aircraft. Well, he went up, I can't remember, it was a day or so later, the first officer flew with a brand new, fairly new captain at United Express. And they had even talked about it. But in the weather, it was one of those scenarios where the weather was marginal. They had external factors as far as crew rest issues. They had just, scheduling, trying to get the aircraft on time. So, and up there at Presque Isle, they had made sure that the runway was clear, the lights were all on, et cetera, et cetera. But they had done the first approach, and they didn't see the runway marking. And at one point, they actually almost hit one of the wind sensing antennas. They actually saw it, and they went and did a missed approach, a go around, and they were vectored back around for a second approach. And during the second approach, they had briefed as they were coming back in, like, we'll do this, and if not, we'll continue on to their alternate, which I believe their alternate was Burlington. And they also discussed how they would probably go in a little bit lower the following time. So when you're doing an ILS approach, or any instrument approach for that matter, you're supposed to have the runway environment in sight, and that's clearly defined. You can have, the runway lights, the runway markings, threshold, environment. They never had that, and they continued below their minimums anyway. And they actually contacted that pole on the next approach in, and damaged the aircraft. Everybody got out, but what they found out was the end of the localizer antenna was covered with snow. They had about 5 feet of snow up there, and because of that snow, it created a variation on the course, and actually sideset the course for guidance into the runway by about 200 feet. So they were following those green needles coming in to what they assumed to be correct, and but that guidance was actually off. So they were flying a straight line towards the runway, but the instruments were thinking the runway was 200 feet to the right. Oddly enough, this had been reported by another crew prior to the instance, but the way the FAA works, they need to have 2 reports in order before they'll actually do a flight test and confirm that the equipment is not operational. So this second report came from this accident aircraft. So, this is an example of controlled flight and terrain. They had a perfectly good airplane. They flew into the ground. They kind of looked past a few rules as far as the minimums going. They ducked below the minimums. They didn't have the runway environment in sight. So there were some pilot error issues, but they were pressed for time. Obviously, they'd already done one missed approach. They wanted to get the aircraft on the ground, but they convinced themselves to violate procedures, and the end result was an accident. So, like I said, that link is in the notes, and you guys can watch that later. It's really, really good. It's an Embraer 145. I've never flown one of those. I've flown the 170, 190 series. It's fairly similar, but the person doing this brief really goes through a lot of the items of the accident and has some great animation that should really kind of bring more sense. But that's the 1/50 view of it all is what I gave you about that. But once again, it's continuation bias and controlled flight in terrain. So with that, Mary, I think you figured out how to unmute yourself.
I did.
So,
I didn't have the app. That's what the problem was.
oh, okay.
So there was no, I was denied any speaker
All right. Well,
capability.
we have you now. So I just want to welcome Mary. She's agreed to come on. Hopefully, we'll continue to have these aviation safety topics, and I'd like to get access to people like Mary. So if anyone out there, if you have a business or if you're an individual in the aviation community in Maine and you'd like to get on here and talk to other people, please reach out to me so that when we put this together, we can get you scheduled. With that, Mary, I've got your website up here for a background for a talking piece. I'll kind of scroll through that first, but if you want to just give your brief introduction about your life here as a DPE in Maine, as a fixed base operator, a seaplane operator, and I guess you'll probably want to touch on your Kodiak incident as well.
Yeah, the Kodiak incident is interesting, and I can get into that in a minute. But the reason I wrote the book that you're scrolling through now, Finding Myself in Aviation, was because when I was doing scenic flights, everybody would ask, or a lot of people would ask, how did you ever get into, or why did you ever get into seaplane flying? So when I told them the story, they invariably said, "Oh, you're such an inspiration. You should write a book." Well, I had no idea what they were talking about. I totally had no idea because I was just doing what I love to do, and I was so excited to finally find something. I didn't even start flying until I was 47. So anyway, eventually I started writing a book, and it has taken 7 years because writing is not my forte by any means, but with the help of a writing group and so forth, I was able to publish the book. And I'm on a second printing right now, and it has been very well received. In it are stories about the 4 different flights that I've taken to Alaska and different situations I've gotten into in those trips. And the seaplane operations, and Greenville, of course, and all experiences at Greenville over the years, and then the Kodiak accident. I was very fortunate, but we were both very fortunate to get out of that accident without any injuries and get out alive to start with. Many people don't survive an overturned seaplane accident. It wasn't because the wheels were down. There were a series of situations that, or leading up to it. It was very, very hot, humid August day, and Brandy Pond was very, very busy. And we had switched roles. I usually flew right seat on the first trip of the day, and my co-pilot Joe would sit left seat. And we switched it that morning because I had never done a cold start and he had never done a hot start. And so I flew, and it was really the first time. We were preparing for a check ride on Tuesday for the Part 135. And it was real, that day of flying was the first time I felt comfortable. I did a simulated instrument approach into Freiburg, broke off, landed in the water, took off from there, and flew back to Auburn-Lewiston after several different things that we had done, and had lunch, and then Joe flew. But the winds had picked up, and the winds were from the southwest, which is miserable in the summertime, and Brandy Pond was just loaded with boats. And not only boats, but of course wakes. And so we circled a couple of times, and when we came into land, it was just a crosswind, and there's nothing different about landing an seaplane in a crosswind. We do it all the time. There's also nothing different about adding a little bit of power to skip over the wakes to land where it's smoother. And that's what Joe did. However, we had never done that in the Kodiak. We had always come in and cut the power instead of adding power. And so when we land, and there was only there's a sweet spot on landing the Kodiak, and it's only about 6 inches long. And if you land any further forward than that, and again, this was never pointed out to us, and we had never experienced it before, it turned very sharply to the left, and we could not correct it. Eventually, the left float lifted, the brackets on the right side of the float broke, the wing hit the water, and we cartwheeled. And because I talk about that, I won't even get in as an examiner. I won't even get in an airplane unless that student gives me a very good pre-flight briefing, including what to do if the plane becomes overturned. And obviously, when doing seaplane training, I talk about it every single time. So I was actually comfortable with the plane being upside down. We were just sitting there. Joe couldn't get the door open, and I said, well, we just wait. We just have to wait for the plane to settle. And then we were fortunate too that the Kodiak is built like a tank, and no windows broke, so we didn't have any water inside the aircraft. And I mean, that's a huge thing, because most seaplane pilots survive the accident but drown. Unfortunately, they can't get out fast enough, or they've hit their head and they're unconscious or whatever. We had brand new shoulder harnesses and seatbelt systems, so that the only thing that moved when we were cartwheeling was my head. The rest of us, I was just locked in my seat. I never budged. And that's another plus. And then, and so once the plane settled, Joe opened just the call window. It's just like a 8x8 window over on his side. I didn't have any door on my side. And so the water started to come in, and I had told him, don't take your seatbelt off until we're ready to get out, because obviously we're upside down and we would tumble. And the problem with that is sometimes you become disorientated, but we were just sitting there. But when the water started to come in, it was filling my side very, very quickly. So I undid my seatbelt, but when I did, he undid his and fell onto me. And so, wait a second, I just got to touch something in, there we go, okay. So, in the meantime, the water is rushing in, and I was just waiting, because it was coming in so fast, we were going to float. And he was able to open the door and got out. And when I was on my way out, the plane had filled with so much more water that it started to sink, and the door closed right on my middle and dragged me down under the water. And I didn't have time to take a breath and talk. So I just said door as I went right under the water. And fortunately, he heard me. And, I've grown up in the water, and I'm particularly comfortable in it. I had swimming lessons as a young kid and grew up on boats, jumping canyons into the water. I mean, all kinds of things on the water. But it was the first time that I was dragged underwater without taking a breath. And it certainly is very different. I just couldn't believe I was going to go that way. But Joe turned around and he put his right leg on the fuselage, his left hand on the handle of the door, and his right hand on my arm, and pulled me out. And I didn't have any injuries. The only thing that he had was a scrape on his shin from the door when he opened it. So we were very, very fortunate. That's the long and short of it. And the NTSB knows what was wrong, but because of legal situations, they never stated it. And I've never made it public because of that. But I will say that the accident and incident rate with that combination of Kodiak on Whip Air's floats, amphibious floats, was 42%. And the Fish and Wildlife had purchased 9 of them. They had purchased 9 sets of floats and had them installed on Kodiaks, and they were all up in Anchorage. And all of those floats, little by little, had been taken off and replaced with Arasets. While they were still on the Kodiaks, the pilots were not allowed, because there was another accident just like ours in Lake Hood, and where she added power to do a step taxi, which is not at all unusual. It's very, very, very common on floats. Just adding a little, once you land, you add a little power and you stay on the step to get where you're going. And we just had added power prior to the landing, but still there was power. And so anyway, none of the pilots up there were allowed to land on the water. They had to just land on land until they could afford to remove those floats. So gives you an indication of what was the issue. And I had an interesting conversation with an engineer who called me and said, "Oh, I saw a really good price on a Kodiak on Whip Air floats. What do you think?" And I said I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. He said, "Why?" And so I gave him the reasons, and he looked at it, and he could see plainly. It was evidently the shape of the bottom of the floats. I don't have any written information. I don't have any authority. I'm not an engineer, but it happened. But that's why we were safe. We followed what we should do. We waited until the plane got settled, and then opened the door, and then took our seat belts off. That's the order we should have done it, but I couldn't because I was going to drown on that side of the plane. But anyway, that was the Kodiak accident. There was another situation going to Alaska, and I've looked back on that event, and there were many things that I would have done. But this last conversation that you just had of all of the making a different decision, of going a different day, not doing something or needing to get there, all of those entered into this situation. I don't remember the exact airports that I was between, but we were following the Alcan Highway, just starting to follow the Alcan Highway. And there had been a low system sitting out west of the area, which is not uncommon going through Canada, going to Anchorage. And I could watch that system coming all the way across the country. And on one of the trips, once we got to Whitehorse, one of the pilots was just too tired. He just didn't want to go on that day. And I said, "That's okay. We're certainly not going to go if you're tired. I just need to tell you that if we don't, this low is apt to come in and we will not be able to, go for several days." He said, "That's okay. I'm not going to fly." I said, "Oh, that's fine. No problem." So we were there for 3 days because the low did come in. It had been sitting there, but it did come in. So on this next flight that I was on, or I don't know if it was the next one or 2 after that, it was absolutely perfectly clear underneath the clouds. The ceiling was 1,500 feet. So I talked to flight service and I asked them how long the weather had been like that. And he said because it's different at different times of year. And I was going up in August this time, and all my other trips were in May. So I asked him how long the weather had been like that. And he said it had been like that for 2 weeks. I said, have people been flying in those conditions? He said, yes, every day, all day, they've been flying in that. I said, okay, thank you. So I was following the highway and then decided that if I had any trouble, I would land on the highway. I wasn't out of that airport, and I had 3 other airplanes following me. And I was down low, obviously because of the ceiling, but I was in between the mountains and following the highway. And those clouds came down and completely surrounded me, completely surrounded me. And the GPS was screaming, terrain, terrain, terrain. I couldn't see the road because of the GPS flashing. I couldn't see the mountains. I couldn't turn around, number one, because of the mountains, and I could have turned to the right. I had room to turn to the right. I could not turn to the left because of I was right beside a mountain. But all of those planes were behind me, and I didn't know where they were. So I was able to tell them to turn around before they got into trouble, which they did. And I just climbed. And it's the closest that I have in all of the years that I've been, on the 30 years I've been flying, that's the closest that I've come to being sure I was not going to make it. And I just climbed and climbed and climbed. And I was in communication with air traffic control, and went up to 9,000 feet, which was the minimum safe IFR altitude. I had IFR and VFR charts with me. And when I was up at 9,000 feet, I was picking up ice. So I said, and I looked at the VFR charts and found that 8,000 feet was minimum safe for VFR. And I said that I was going to descend to 8,000 feet. And they said I couldn't because they wouldn't be, I couldn't because it was not legal IFR. I said, I'm descending to 8,000 feet. I don't have the capability of removing the ice. And they said, well, we can't see you if you're down there. I said, I'm descending. And I'm going to have to take that risk because I can't stay at 9,000 feet. So every 5 minutes, they'd ask for my latitude and longitude. And you'd think that that would be very comforting, but it was very discomforting because they couldn't see me. And the fact was, they would not be able to find me. There is nothing between those airports if you try to go direct, except for mountains. There are no houses, there are no roads, there are no fields, there is nothing but mountains. And so they were keeping track of me. And then when I landed and canceled IFR, called, and he said, we are so sorry. I said, look, you have nothing to be sorry about. I made the decision to make the flight, and people had been flying, and I just wasn't able to, and the weather changed. And I said, I'm safe, I'm not hurt, the airplane's not hurt, and thank you for the assistance that I did get. So those are the 2 experiences that I had, and yeah, both pretty bad, pretty scary.
As a result of those two incidents, is there anything that you changed? I know you talked about your pre-flight briefing that you had with your students, but what about that incident in Alaska? What was something that you kind of took away from that changed how you operated as a pilot?
You know, it's the flying in that area and in Alaska is very, very different from the lower 48. It's very, very different. And you're not going anywhere if you don't fly in it. And if you're willing to take the risk, looking back on it, the biggest thing was not being able to see the road on the GPS in order to climb safely. And that's the biggest thing that I would have changed. I would have figured out a way to stop that. I couldn't keep hitting the enter button to clear it, to see the road, and handle everything else that I was doing at the same time. If I were to advise anyone, I would tell them not to make the flight and to wait, obviously, wait for the following day. And that's what the other 3 pilots did.
So I see on your website that you're in the process of writing a second book. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, what surprised me was my editor suggested it. And that, to me, that's the biggest compliment I've ever received. She, with all of the comments that some of my students have written, she said, you really should write a book about the different ways you have to change when you're teaching students. You know, when you learn how to instruct, you're given directions, you talk about it, you do it, you talk about it, and then the pilot, whatever that order is, I never remember what the order is, but I always do it. And but it doesn't work for everybody. You have to, everybody learns differently. And so I thought, well, you know, I probably have 2 or 3 different examples that I could think of. Well, so far I have 12 different ways that I've needed to change the way I teach so that someone understands what I'm saying. I had one man that after 10 hours, he couldn't even steer the plane on the water. And his situation was he had just sold his business and had to let people go that had worked for him for 42 years. So after talking about it, he was more relaxed. He was the first customer that I had that I decided, look, these people are here to learn how to fly. He wanted to fly to Alaska with his son, and he wanted to be able to help. And I thought, if he ever gets in that left seat and his son doesn't know what the situation is, they're going to be in trouble. So we flew as long as he needed to fly so that he could pass his check ride. But I did talk to his son and told him what the situation was, and that so his son could sit right seat, but he couldn't go to sleep or anything like that. You know, he would have to pay attention, or he could let his dad fly from the right seat, but he don't go to sleep. You know, it's not something that was safe for him to do. And today I ran into a situation which was really kind of interesting. We were talking about that the student only has about 8 hours, and he doesn't have he never had any wind, and today he had wind. And we had tried to do just a little bit of wind the last time, and he couldn't figure out how to not do a rectangular pattern. So we talked about it at length before we flew this morning, and I was talking about crabbing in order to stay parallel, doing a rectangular pattern. And so we were up there, and he still couldn't do it. He said, I know what you want me to do, but I don't know how to do it. What he didn't understand is he had to turn the airplane. So he didn't understand crabbing. You know, to me, I know what crabbing means, and I know how to do it. I never questioned it. He didn't know. He just simply had to turn the airplane. But if he kept those controls in, he would turn in a whole circle. And he couldn't figure it out. So by the end of once he said that, I was able to tell him what to do, then he understood and he could do it. So and then I think the biggest example of somebody who needs to be somebody different was this person came to me for seaplane training, and she was a Pilatus pilot, and she could not land a seaplane. She could not fly a pattern. You don't have to fly a pattern when you're teaching somebody how to fly a seaplane, and they don't have to fly a pattern if they don't want to. But I usually keep them in a pattern because that's what they're accustomed to doing. And so, and then after they get the knack of it, then they can, just circle around to land if that's what they would like to do. But this person could not do that. She could not fly the pattern. So she came back, she left in tears one day, and I thought, oh, brother, what a failure. What on earth has gone wrong? I can't figure this one out. She came back the next day, and she said, I think I figured out what's wrong. And she said, all I want to do is fly. I want to fly and do one landing, and then I just want you to take me on a senior flight. I said, okay. And she landed perfectly without any trouble at all. Her trouble was she couldn't see a runway. She could not, even though I put her in a cove, not a cove, but an opening that was just didn't have four sides. It had three sides, but it didn't have four sides. She could not visualize a runway anywhere. It was just what didn't exist for her. So once she realized that, she was able to land. And I have run into a couple of other people like that, but I could recognize it the next couple of times. So anyway, the long and short of it is my editor thought that this would be a helpful book for instructors to realize that there are different ways of teaching and getting the point across. There are different ways that people learn. So I'm working on that, and we'll just see how it comes out. But in any case, I'm very busy with this book, and it seems to be going well, which surprises me. I had no idea how it was going to sell, but even pilots like it.
Well, I guess I can open it up. Is there any questions from the group here? There's about, looks like 11 people on here right now. If you have any questions, you can just raise your hand and unmute yourself and then ask Mary. If not, or any questions about the course material as well. If you don't have any other questions, Mary, I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add about the course material that we talked about. I think you kind of talked a little bit about, a lot about the material, just, with your own insights on your own incidents that you had. But is there anything else that you want to add before we call it a night?
I can't think of anything. No, I can't think of anything right now.
Are you
Of course, I
teaching
will
down
later, but not now.
Are you down in Lewiston now, or where are you instructing?
I'm teaching out of Oxford, and
Oh, okay.
and if anybody has any students that are having trouble studying on their own, I'm starting a ground school in January, a 12-week ground school on Saturday mornings.
Oh, you'll have to make sure you pass that on because I can add that information to the calendar.
Okay, great. I will.
Yeah. And for everyone else out there, I do try. I kind of probably my introduction in the beginning wasn't very, very good about who I am and what I do, but I also run the main flying page in the group as well. And I try to do my best to include all the events that are going on in the state of Maine. So if you have anything out there, any events, you can let me know and I'll advertise any fly-ins, any event at all. Just let me know and I try to spread that. Jason, looks like you have a question. You raise your hand if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, mine's regarding the Presque Isle incident. What, if anything, can be taken away from that, being that it was a situation that has to be reported twice to be corrected? What could be done differently?
They changed their procedures because they ended up, they had, I think it was 5 feet of snow that they had in there, and that ended up being the contributing factor, that it was just the localizer course was just offset because of the snow. And I don't know if, they changed their procedures at that airport and probably other airports as well, as to make sure that area was clear. So they just increased the clear area out of there. So really, I mean, it was pilot error in the end. They didn't have the runway environment in sight, and but they trusted that the localizer course that they were following, that they were on course. They just made the assumption that it was tracking down the center of the runway, and obviously it wasn't. So ultimately, it's not really, that's a contributing factor, but the ultimate accident is a result of the pilots not following company procedure and not following FAA procedures as far as having the runway environment in sight before descending below minimums. And they didn't have the runway lights in sight. Because you can continue down below on the ILS another 100 feet if you have just the approach lights in sight. You can continue, and then you need to have the runway environment in sight before you descend below those 100 feet. And if you don't, you're supposed to execute a missed approach. But they intentionally ducked under, and then they did not have the environment in sight, and they just put it in the snow. So, and they're very lucky because if you look at the damage on the aircraft, the one of the main gear I think came off and took out the left engine, and no injuries at all. So they're very fortunate.
Yeah, I do recall. It's so in essence, don't have blind faith in your instruments and don't descend below minimums.
Pretty much. And I know that, I mean, there's all kinds of situations out there. Like you're always tempted. I can think of one flight that I did I was flying the Embraer 190 and I was flying into Nantucket. And Nantucket, as you know, the weather out there is just terrible. And I had plenty of fuel. We had an alternate for Boston. And I had enough fuel. I could have gone back to, I think I was at LaGuardia. Maybe it was JFK anyway. I had plenty of fuel to even go back, but Boston was my alternate. And I tried 3 times to get in there. And these Cape Air flights that had, you know, we had a HUD on our aircraft, you know, and the Cape Air guys were getting in, and there's no way, because their minimums aren't any different than our minimums. And, you know, I was going down to 200 feet. I didn't have the runway environment in sight. And, you know, I'm going around, and then you get this twin Cessna going in, and they're landing just fine. So, you know, there's that feeling of like, well, he's getting in, maybe I should too. So that's kind of that get there-itis, whereas like, well, he did it, why can't I do it? So I tried another 2 times until I was basically at my bingo fuel, where I had to deviate and go to the alternate of Boston where the weather was fine. But there's no way that those guys were seeing the runway environment. They were just continuing on and getting to the runway eventually, I guess. So, but I
And
wasn't interested in doing
I
that.
allowed myself to do the same thing. All those other pilots were getting through, 2 weeks, and I was sure that I would be able to too. So it's same thing.
And that's where you kind of have to just know what the rules are and not deviate from it and stick to the procedures. And what are they going to do? They're going to make fun of you, but
That's
so we
right.
ended up going to Boston, and they're inconvenienced some passengers. They had to bus them all down, and they had to take the ferry over. But I'd rather have that happen than an incident like that in Presque Isle. So it is what it is. Any other comments, questions?
I guess they should have booked Cape Air instead.
Probably you would have got in. Yeah. Sorry about that. So anyway, well, that's pretty much all I have for you guys for tonight. Once again, this will be recorded, so I'll probably put a post on the group page and on Facebook as well, so people can get that information. But I put in the chat section, I put out a couple links in there, including that scenario that happened up in Presque Isle with a Colgan flight. Pretty interesting watch if you guys want to take a listen and watch of that. So besides that, that's pretty much it. No other questions. I'll go ahead and end the presentation. Thanks for joining.
Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it.